First thing you do, you take a drink, and after they've had their first one, they start to get warm. Now, they wipe their face off, and when they put their handkerchiefs back, it's never in the same position, you see. Now, the next, after a couple of more drinks, they begin to itch.
They'd found him crying on camera. Not the slapstick, painted smile you remember, but a man with the grease paint washed away, talking like someone who'd finally let the lid off a life he'd guarded for decades. When Tubi dropped that footage in October 2024, 2 million people stopped scrolling because what they saw wasn't a comedian telling jokes. It was Red Skelton confessing the private debts his laughter had never paid. Red was born on July 18th, 1913, into a house that barely held a family. 2 months after his father, a circus clown who'd given joy to strangers and never had enough to give his own children, died of heart failure. The family was left raw and exposed. Hunger and cold taught him early that humor could be a currency. A joke could buy a loaf of bread. A smile could soften a woman handing over a pawned wedding ring. By 7, he was hawking papers, and by 10, he was juggling jobs to keep the lights on. The medicine show at age 10 turned a survival skill into a craft. A boy who slept in barns learned to turn a stumble into applause. There's a brutal tenderness in people who grow up like that. They learn to make light while the dark gathers. Red's face became a map of those early winters and missed dinners. Every twitch, every exaggerated eye roll held the memory of a mother who kept going, even when there was nothing left to give. He ran away at 15 with $135 in his pocket, and the world rewarded him by being exactly what it had always been, harsh. But on circuses and small stages, he breathed. The sawdust smelled like home. The silence before a punchline taught him to listen. The silence after a death taught him to speak in other people's voices. Hit after hit followed. Clem Kadiddlehopper, Freddy the Freeloader, George Appleby, characters who made America laugh, and who paradoxically let Red say the things he couldn't say as a man. He could make a nation giggle about a henpecked husband or a lovable tramp and slip in tenderness between pratfalls. Yet success was a complicated currency. The studio checks bought mansions, but not peace. MGM wrapped him in contracts and expectations. He worked until he collapsed on air in 1943, the doctors calling it exhaustion. Red called it the worst night of his life. And when he returned, the jokes were darker, the pauses longer. Laughter had sharpened into confession. And then grief arrived with the force of a train. His son Richard fell ill. The public didn't know at first. Skelton kept the cameras smiling while he went to vigils alone. When Richard died, something broke inside him that no comeback could glue back together. He tried to end his life. Comebacks followed out of habit more than hope. He built hospitals and learning centers for children, charity that read like penance, like an attempt to put a bandage on a wound he never learned to stop touching. The later footage that sat in vaults for 40 years shows the man at the very edge of performance and truth. The famous 45-minute Freddy the Freeloader Christmas dinner that Tubi restored is the spine of the release. A scene that becomes a confession. In between the scripted tender moments, Red stops acting and starts speaking to the lens, the way men speak to therapists and old friends. Raw, unpolished, honest. He talks about his father dying under a circus tent a month before he was born. He talks about stealing routines in a desperate youth because he thought that theft was the only way out of hunger. He says plainly, if I hadn't pinched those scripts, I'd still be selling soap on the streets. The camera catches the tremor in his hand as he says it. That admission, that the laughter he sold was purchased with a theft and a hunger, hits like a cold wind. The footage is painful because it exposes what we normally let comics hide behind: the mask. Red's routine with Freddy had always felt like charity. Now we see it was also apology. The man who'd made a career of turning sorrow into silliness had simply been trying to survive his own sorrow in plain sight. When he laughs between lines on those tapes, it's not the practiced chuckle you expect. It's survival. Those reels, also resurfaced, show him trying to wrestle the country's conscience into a joke that would refuse to let us forget the cruelty we normalized. He wasn't always safe. Sometimes the network silenced him. Sometimes he silenced himself. Watching those unaired moments now, you see an artist who kept tugging at the seam of the era until it bled. There's also the human cost behind the headlines: gambling debts, studio fights, violent public rows. A marriage cracked by betrayal. A hand broken after an angry moment in a hotel hallway. A car crash in his 70s that left him in pieces. In his later years, he turned to painting, producing hundreds of canvases that felt like the only quiet he ever allowed himself. People who only knew the laugh line saw galleries full of Freddy portraits selling for 6 figures. Those who watched the vaults saw a man painting to keep from drowning. The restoration team did something small and enormous. They treated the fragile film like a human relic rather than an archival asset. They cleaned frames to 4K. They stabilized breath and tiny facial twitches. They preserved the silence as much as the sound. The result is cinematic intimacy. You see the clay of his face. You see the fleck of moisture in the corner of an eye as he confesses to a theft he once called survival. That detail is the why. People stop scrolling because these tapes give you the taste of another human being finally allowed to be honest. Why release it now, 40 years later? Maybe because we live in an era desperate for authenticity. Maybe because the estates and archive finally realized that the public doesn't just want curated triumphs. It wants the messy ledger behind them too. Or maybe it's because time softens legal worries and sharpens appetite for truth. But there's a kinder explanation. The world had finally grown a little humbler. We were ready to watch a beloved clown mourn. We were ready to hold an icon's confession like a fragile object and accept that heroes can be thieves, saints can be sinners, and laughter is sometimes a last resort, not a choice. After the Tubi release, young people who'd never heard Red Skelton before discovered how powerful silence can be. They shared clips of his mime work and debated whether physical comedy could say more than 1,000 words. Older viewers returned, wiping their eyes and remembering a father, a grandfather, a living room where everybody pretended the joke was everything. The internet's usual snark softened into something like respect. Cable channels dug up more reels. Museums asked for shows. People lined up to see the paintings and to stand where the man who performed them once stood. But the tapes do more than resuscitate a career. They remind us that every laugh has a ledger. They teach us to look beyond the mask and ask the simple, difficult question: what did you spend to make me smile? Red Skelton's answer, as he whispers it on those vault tapes, is both merciless and tender. He spent himself. He traded his hunger and his shame for a nation's joy. He bought bread with jokes and tried to barter away grief with applause. There's mercy in that confession. Watching him cry on camera does something rare. It makes us feel less alone. It reminds us that asking for help, telling the truth, showing the wound, These are braver acts than delivering a perfect punchline. Red Skelton made us laugh until we remembered how to breathe. In those long hidden minutes, he taught us how to forgive a man for being human.